Today's gospel parable reminds us that where our riches are, our wealth is in the kingdom of heaven. When I was a sophomore in high school, many years ago, I remember being made to read a novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald called The Great Gatsby. Do the kids read Great Gatsby anymore, or is it thought to be too quaint and old-fashioned? Well, if you remember, the central character called himself J. Gatsby, and he grew up as a poor boy, and he was in love with Daisy, a rich girl. And as Daisy would eventually tell him, J. Gatsby, poor boys don't marry rich girls. So he lost her. He decided he was going to do everything to win her back, which meant he had to get to be filthy rich to impress her. So by hook or crook, mainly by crook, he amassed a fortune. And he thought what he would do is we would show off how much money he had by having these lavish parties at his mansion with all the grounds around it and the swimming pool and the booze flowing and the bands playing and everything else. And that way he would win back his love and he would gain friendships with other people. Well, guess what? It didn't work. He didn't win Daisy back, and he actually didn't win any friendships from giving the parties. He had one friend who would have liked him no matter what. So the parties, the money, the possessions didn't work. And in fact, a Mr. Wilson shot him, if you remember. Mistook him for somebody else, but he still killed him. In a lot of ways, the unnamed person in today's gospel parable is a lot like J. Gatsby. He becomes fixated on wealth, on possessions, and the things he thinks he can do with the wealth and the possessions that he's got. He's made so much stuff that he's got to tear his barns down and build bigger silos and everything else to house everything that he has. But God didn't particularly like that, did he? God said, "You're a fool. You fool. This night your life will be demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, to whom will they belong?" You see, what benefit is there in storing up all these possessions if those possessions are not what matters to God? You see, neither Jay nor that man understood what really matters to God. Now, if you knew that the world would end a month from today, because you have it on good word from your best friend, like John Conroy or somebody, that the world's going to end in 1 month, what would you do? Jesus told today's parable to try to address that question. So let me give you another parable or another story that addresses that question as well. And hopefully with a little humor involved. Because I think Jesus' parable is deadly serious, isn't it? But there was this filthy rich man who wanted to take his wealth with him to heaven. And he had a cadre of lawyers. Now, my apologies to any lawyers tonight. I see Jim Hall's not here, so at least maybe we don't have any lawyers. But you and I know once lawyers are mentioned, this story is going downhill from this point on. So he hires his cadre of lawyers, and he says he wants to bring a lawsuit against heaven so he can carry his wealth with him when he dies. St. Peter must have been in a kind of a strange mood that day, because he decides to go outside of court and settle this thing. And the man's allowed to bring one suitcase with him when he comes to heaven. The day finally arrives, and he shows up at the pearly gates, and St. Peter has the keys ready to open the gates, and he looks at him, and St. Peter begins to faint. What the man has with him is 8 feet by 6 feet and 5 feet deep. That's his suitcase. St. Peter says, That's not a suitcase. And the man says, well, he never told me the dimensions. In other words, St. Peter doesn't know what the airlines do about the size and weight of everything. So the man tricked him. But St. Peter did learn from how the airports work. He said, well, you'll have to open it up so I can see what's in it. So he opened it up, and it was jam-packed with gold bars. The man must have been watching those William Devane commercials about what's in your safe, about buying gold and silver. And St. Peter started to laugh. The man got very annoyed. What are you laughing about? All you went through with the lawsuit and everything else, and all the lawyers and everything else, am I willing to, like, you bring up pavement to heaven? The yellow brick road. They were going to walk on this stuff. What St. Peter was trying to tell them was, everything that you thought was important, all those possessions you had, really are meaningless. They mean nothing at all. Now, Jesus knows that you and I need money. It in and of itself is not sinful. We need money, right? For a home. Put food on the table. Put clothes on our back. Educate the kids. So on and so forth. Pay the mortgage. Pay for the car. Whatever happens to be. We need money. We need a certain amount of wealth. But what Jesus is talking about is when our whole life gets so centered, where possessions become so central to us, that the attainment of those possessions become what drives us in our lives. It becomes the all-important thing. It becomes like a God to us. Our lives are driven by the attainment of those possessions. And that's what Scripture calls greed. Now, for the Sam Weivels of the world, do you all know Sam Weivels, one of our parishioners? He's always after me to do biblical exegesis within the homily, particularly social science commentary about what's going on in this homily based upon the way that people thought and believed in Jesus' time. So I'm going to do a sidebar. This drives him crazy when I do it. Sidebar about why, if you ever asked yourself this question, why are rich people thought so poorly of in the New Testament? Remember, Jesus says at one point, and we've heard it, you know, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. Remember, his disciples are flabbergasted. If a rich man can't get into heaven who has time to pray and read Torah and everything else, then what chance do I have as a poor peasant to get into heaven? Or think of Tevye, you know, and you know, Fiddler on the Roof. If I were a rich man, right? I'll stop there. Okay, you got the idea. Because he says, now if I'm rich, I can read Torah all day. I can converse with the rabbis. I can have arguments about the law and everything else and how to live my life, because I'll have some free time instead of having to spend all my time working just to subsist. Well, the problem was, in Jesus' time, the thought was that everything that exists or ever will exist has already been made. There's only so much of everything. There's only so much gold and so much silver and so much wheat and everything else, commodities in the world, and each person is given a certain amount that goes with their station in life. And what they're supposed to do is keep that and not grow it bigger. It's like life were a big pie, and everybody has a slice of this pie. Your slice might be that big. If you take that much, that means you stole it from somebody else. You're a thief. So if a rich man gets richer, he's a thief, because he's taken something away from somebody else, because you can't make more pies. I used to teach total quality management. Deming used to say, just make more pies. Everybody will have more. Not in that culture. Everything was finite. All the possessions were already there. And if you made more than what you're supposed to have, then you're a thief. You're dishonorable if you intend to do that. Now, if you don't intend to do that and you just happen to have a big crop, like this guy had, what that society said to do was this: don't build bigger barns, give the excess away. Remember John the Baptist, we hear about in Advent, the people came to him and said, John, what should we do? And he said, well, those who have 2 cloaks should give 1 to the person who has none. In other words, I only got 1 body, I only need 1 cloak. If I got 2 cloaks, that cloak isn't really mine, it belongs to somebody else. Give that to the other person. So rich people who grow richer are thieves and dishonorable people. And that's the reason why rich people are described so disfavorably in the New Testament. Because if they're greedy and they grow more wealth, then they've taken it away from you and from me. Notice this guy fits into that, doesn't he? I mean, he doesn't mention anything about the peasants who have worked so hard to produce all that stuff. What's the pronoun used in this parable? I will tear down, I will store, I will say to myself. He doesn't think about anybody else. He doesn't have relationships with other people. He doesn't have love in his life. He's encapsulated himself around all these possessions that he's made, and he wants to grow more and more and more and more so that he can sit back fat, dumb, and happy and enjoy it for himself. He's a lot like Jay Gatsby in that way, of putting all this emphasis on possessions. I came across some interesting data the other day. Did you know that 22% of all children in the United States live in poverty? Did you know that 80% of all the people who live in the world live on less than $10 a day? 80%. Did you know that the average salary for a teacher in the United States is $43,000? The backup second baseman for the New York Yankees makes $1.5 million. I was watching Major League Baseball the other day. We're coming to August 1st. August 1st is a critical day in baseball because after August 1st, in order to trade somebody, they've got to go through waivers. And so in MLB Network, they're saying, well, this team ought to get this guy, and this team ought to get that guy, and they ought to trade for this, and all this other kinds of stuff. And they said, well, this one guy, they ought to trade for because he's got a very favorable contract. Next year, he'll only make $7.5 million. Only $7.5 million? The median income in the United States for a household is $50,000. If you work for 20 years, cumulatively you make $1 million. You and I are never going to make $7.5 million if we lived forever. Something is out of whack here in our country. So back to my initial question. What would you do if you knew for sure the world was going to end 1 month from today? I'll tell you what you would do. You would call certain people. You would text, in today's world, certain people. You would email certain people you have relationships with. And you would say one of 3 things, or maybe all 3 things. I'm sorry. I forgive you. I love you. Why is that? Because you know in your heart what really matters is your relationship to God and to one another. Not how much money you have, how many cars you have, how many houses you have, where you live, and what your neighborhood is like. It only matters what your relationship is with God and others. In other words, the gospel is telling us that we need to live today what matters forever. Because that's what really matters to God. And understand, next week, we're going to hear Jesus say, where your heart is, there is your treasure also. Where's your heart?